Good morning and welcome to the opening of the Newark Public Library's Black History Celebration, the Art and Beauty of Black Power, a century of cinema, dance, and music. My name is Dale Colston and I'm the principal librarian at the James Brown African American Room of the Newark Public Library in Newark, New Jersey. On behalf of our director, Jocelyn Bowling Dixon, and Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, we thank you all for joining us this morning. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape First Nations on which we are learning, laboring, and organizing today. We also recognize the devastation and continued legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, which contributed to present-day systemic racism and oppression. Our space at the library, the James Brown African American Room, was named in honor of the late James Library Brown, a librarian, poet, activist, and influencer who was instrumental in making sure that the library seek and maintain books and resources and present programs examining the African American experience. Mr. Brown was especially committed to urging Newark youth to pursue education and to understand the importance of the library's role in their academic growth. This year, our exhibit, Black Power, 19th Century, the First African American Rebellion and Related Programs reflect the research, artistry, and vision of my colleague, Noelle Lorraine Williams. Noelle Lorraine Williams lives and works in Newark, New Jersey. She is a graduate of the New School for Social Research and Rutgers University, Newark. As a public humanities specialist, artist, researcher, and curator, her work examines the ways African Americans utilize culture to re-examine liberation in the United States. Her work as an artist and curator has been reviewed in the Star Ledger, New York Times, Art News, and other publications. Last year, the exhibition she curated at the Newark Public Library, Radical Women, was the recipient of the Giles R. Wright Award for contributions to African American history in New Jersey. She is a recipient of the 2021 Artist Fellowship Awards from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. Please join me in welcoming Noelle Lorraine Williams.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this powerful series and exhibition. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, I look forward to continuing to welcome you all to these virtual programs and as we reopen to the library. I'm just going to discuss a little bit about the programs, these very special programs that we'll be sharing with you over the next couple of weeks. We've been preparing for a couple of months just to be able to provide this information in this virtual format as we deal with the grief and the surprises and also the transformations that we've experienced during this period dealing with COVID-19, as well as the transformations we've experienced participating in the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements for justice here in the United States. So the Art and Beauty of Black Power is a series of talks and interviews, and it powerfully illuminates the ways that the stories of liberation that African Americans have told have transformed the world. Again, so many thanks to PNC Foundation. They continue to support the Newark Public Library year after year. There are some very important ideas we want to engage with you over the next couple of weeks regarding. We want to talk about in these series and workshops how liberation, Black stories of liberation told through art have literally transform the world and the nation and our local communities, including Black Power, LGBTQ rights, and the Black Lives Matter movement. We want to embrace how we embrace all aspects of our culture. Definitely on this morning, we should give a shout out to Carter G. Woodson, who created Negro History Week. But we also think of this whole development of what I would call an electronic griot, right? So how we continue to tell stories through music and through cinema and other means, as well as folk and urban culture and rural cultures. And also, one of the things that undergirds this discussion is utilizing local museums and libraries as discussion and action spaces. And finally, prioritizing Newark and Essex-based stories. So 80% of our program are folks who are from Newark or the Essex County area. We have luminaries, we have folks on the ground who have been continuing to work in our communities, like Savion Glover, who is an international star, who will be a part of the program on February 20th, but who has a dance school here in Newark and still working with students locally as well as internationally, or Pastor Taylor, who's worked with BT, but he also pastors a church here for LGBT folks in the local area and others of faith. And so we're not just concentrating on popular culture and music and dance and all of those things that bring the heart and soul of these contemporary griots, these contemporary African-American historians. But we're also looking at the folks who are literally on the ground creating history, like Crystal here with the Lost Souls Public Memorial Project, where they're looking at Judge Van Winkle shipping numerous amounts of free African-Americans to the Deep South. Or the Peter Mott House in Lawnside. We'll be welcoming those folks who are doing this so that we can amplify the work that we're doing and folks can come to learn more about it. And also in conjunction with this, as Dale said, we will be hosting the virtual exhibition Black Power. Black Power, it's one of the most controversial terms of the 20th century, but we're going to go into Newark's 19th century Black abolitionist lives. It's a local and it's a national movement, and we're going to see how it's the foundation of Newark's 1967 Black Power movement. Whether it's the Black Convention in Newark, as being in conversation with the history of Black conventions in the 1800s, or even Amina Baraka's African Freedom School, which is named after the New York African Free School. We're presenting new scholarship, connections to the national community and visualizing the past. For example, Henry Drayton, who was accused of being a co-conspirator with Denmark Vesey, leaves South Carolina and eventually becomes a teacher and a pastor here in Newark. We show the connections between these national stories and our local stories, not only just to say Newark was a part of it, but to show the depth and the interlocking work that Black abolitionists and Black activist works were doing to free our people. So please visit that at blackpower19thcentury.com. We're also reimagining spaces like the Frederick Douglass Field, which just may look like a field as you pass it, but we're reimagining it of the community that was a part of it. And we're also looking at things that are actually still there, like in the Newark Museum of Art campus, where we're highlighting a well that was created during the pre-revolutionary period by enslaved people, or even what's now known as the Fire Museum or Marcus Ward's Coach House, which is actually also, if you look at it from a Black Power perspective, the home of the Billings family, who were a part of a local church here and had a traveling music troupe. And their son, Walter Billings, was actually seen as the next Blind Tom. And so we're also doing artistic interpretations of historical artifacts. This is a rendition of a video, a poem by Elimas Payson Rogers. The poem's called Logan's Position, and it's from 1859, and I'll share a bit of it with you.
They say I have a daring look, a bold and fearless mien. For this, I'm not accountable. That surely will be seen. I am not poetic, they declare. Strong in every part, with lurid vengeance in my eye. and mischief in my heart. But let each one be slow to judge, till my tale is told, for the reason will appear while I am tartan bold. I am a penitent fugitive. I fled from Tennessee, from chains, whips, and bloodhounds too, in search of liberty. While I stared, I saw my sister flaws, and heard her thrilling prayer. Oh, spare me, master, master, for God's sakes, master, spare me, please.
So we have the opportunity to see literature, poetry written by people in the 1860s and feel the power of it now, and also see how it's the foundation of the spoken word movement that was popular here in Newark during the Black Power era, as well as contemporary Newark, our poets who continue to make spoken word at the library and use the library as a space to come together and to create. So please join us. You will find the link here. It's Black Power 19th Century. It will be a virtual exhibition. The virtual exhibition is up now, and we will have an in-house exhibition later. So thank you very much. And I would like to introduce Antoinette Richardson. Antoinette Richardson currently serves as the Chief of Staff to the Essex County Board of Commissioners. She is the president of the Essex County Board of Commissioners, President Wayne L. Richardson. Most recently, Antoinette served for 4 years as the Chief Education Officer for Mayor Ross J. Baraka's Office of Comprehensive Community Education, where she advised the mayor on education strategies and developed and led collective impact initiatives, including the Newark Children's Cabinet and the Literacy Coalition, #Newark Reads. As a career educator who taught English, theater, and creative writing for the Newark Board of Education, Antoinette also served as a legislative representative and vice president of the Newark Teachers Union. Prior to her retirement in July 2010, Antoinette served as a coordinator at the Newark Board of Education, Marion A. Bolden Student Center, where she developed a core of after-school classes and university partnerships for Newark's high school students. Antoinette was subsequently elected to the Newark Board of Education in 2011, where she served 2 terms, including 3 years as board president. Her work with Newark-based stakeholders, state legislators, and commissioners of education placed her in the forefront of the efforts that ended 22 years of state control of the Newark School District and returned governance to the Newark Board of Education. Thank you, Antoinette Richardson.
Thank you, Nicole. Everyone, just so happy to be here and to introduce this wonderful program today. I bring you greetings from the Board of Trustees of the Newark Public Library, Dr. Lauren Wells, President, Dr. Domingo Morel, Vice President, board members, Dr. Anasa Mott, Dr. Rosemary Steinbaum, Dr. Timothy Christ, Ms. Nicole Johnson, Mr. Miguel Rodriguez, and Mr. Hassan Abdul Sabur. The Newark Library celebrates and it embraces its many diverse communities, and we're delighted once again to celebrate Black history and culture. The last year has been challenging for everyone. And the Board of Trustees applauds Director Jocelyn Dixon and the staff of the Newark Public Library for their diligence in maintaining outstanding virtual programming during this time of pandemic. If you're watching from home, take a second and clap for the wonderful programming at the Newark Public Library during these times. The Board of Trustees is dedicated to ensuring continued library service to Newark residents. Black History Celebration has a special place in our hearts and in the minds of library trustees as we want to continue the mission of our late trustee and friend, Dr. Clement Alexander Price. Clem, as we all called him, was the longest serving board member on the Newark Public Library Trustee Board until his sudden passing in 2014. He loved Newark and he loved the Newark Public Library. Black History Month at the Newark Public Library also always causes me to think of another gentleman that Dale talked about a few minutes ago, who is special to the Newark Public Library story, James Brown, not the entertainer, but our own James Brown. And many of you know that the James Brown African American Room that we call J-Bar was named after him. So we stand on their shoulders, and we hope that today's program and other programs brought to you all year, but especially during Black History Month, furthers the vision that they had for the city of Newark and especially for the Newark Public Library. So now I want to give you some information about our two dynamic, outstanding, and esteemed participants in today's program. Dr. Lonnie G. Bunch III is the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian. He assumed his position in June of 2019. He oversees 19 museums, 21 libraries, the National Zoo, numerous research centers, and several education units and centers. Previously, Bunch was the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. When he started as director in 2005, he had one staff member, no collections, no funding, and no site for a museum. Bunch transformed a vision into a reality. The museum has had more than 7 million visitors since it opened in September of 2016 and compiled a collection of nearly 40,000 objects. Before his appointment as director of the museum, Bunch served as the president of the Chicago Historical Society, 2001 to 2005. A widely published author, Bunch has written on topics ranging from the Black military experience, the American presidency, and all Black towns in the American West, to diversity in museum management and the impact of funding and politics on American museums. His most recent book, A Fool's Errand, Creating the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Age of Bush, Obama, and Trump, chronicles the making of the museum that would become one of the most popular destinations in Washington. Bunch had previously worked at the Smithsonian, holding several positions as its National Museum of American History from 1989 through 2000, where he oversaw the curatorial and collections staff that developed a major permanent exhibition on the American presidency. Born in Belleville, New Jersey, Bunch has held numerous teaching positions across the country, including at American University and George Washington University, both in Washington, D.C., and the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. Among his many awards, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to the Committee for the Preservation of the White House in 2002, and reappointed by President Barack Obama in 2010. In 2019, he was awarded the Freedom Medal, one of the 4 Freedom Awards from the Roosevelt Institute, for his contribution to American culture as a historian and storyteller. The W.E.B. Du Bois Medal from the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, and the National Equal Justice Award from the NAACP's Legal Defense Ward. Bunch received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the American University in Washington, D.C. And so you see why I say that we have esteemed speakers presenting to us today. And now I will talk about our other presenter today. Salamishah Tillet is the Henry Rutgers Professor of African American History. I will start again. Salamishah Tillet is the Henry Rutgers Professor of African American and African Studies and Creative Writing at Rutgers University, Newark. She is the Associate Director of Clement A. Price Institute and the Faculty Director of New Arts Justice at Express Newark, as well as a contributing critic at large for the New York Times. In 2003, with her sister, Scheherazade Tillet, she founded A Long Walk Home, an art organization that empowers young people to end violence against girls and women. She's the author of the recently released cultural memoir, In Search of the Color Purple, the story of an American masterpiece, and the book, Sites of Slavery, Citizenship, and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination. In 2020, she was awarded the Whitting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant for her book in progress, All the Rage, Mississippi Goddamn and the World Nina Simone Made. And so, without further ado, I now present to you our two speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette, for such a generous introduction. And welcome, Secretary Bunch. I will call you Lonnie after this, but I just wanted to acknowledge your esteemed and formal title as we begin our conversation. So welcome back to your hometown or your birth town of Newark, New Jersey. You grew up in Newark, but also Belleville, so I'll acknowledge both. Welcome, how are you?
I am really good, especially to get the chance to talk with you. I'm so proud of the work you've done and the work you continue to do. So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you. We have a mutual friend of Skip Gates in common, so
Oh, yes.
I emailed him yesterday. He said to tell you hello. So hello from Cambridge, Massachusetts. So well, we'll just jump right in terms of I'm located in Newark right now, and not too far away actually from the Clement Price, the Institute, the building that you know quite well because of your relationship with Clem, but also from being from Newark. And so this is a homecoming, even though it's a virtual homecoming. Your parents migrated here. You were born in Newark. Your grandfather, who was born, I believe, as a sharecropper, and then opened his own dentist office here on Springfield Ave. And I live near Springfield Ave, so that's very, very close to my heart as well. You're a child of the migration, and you're a child of desegregation in many ways, or at least integration. And so can you just talk a little bit about how you think of this, the travel that Black people had or did or engaged in to become a free people? How did the migration of your parents, but in the Great Migration in general, shape you in your career?
Well, I think, like you, I've learned so much from people like Clem Price and Giles Wright. So I want to acknowledge them first and foremost. My grandparents migrated from North Carolina to Newark in 1909.
Mm.
My grandfather wanted to be a dentist, was prepared to be a dentist, but didn't have the money to get started, so he ended up working in factories in Newark until 1920. My grandmother actually lived in as a maid in Montclair. So in essence, what you see is the migration means that they've changed the trajectory of generations of the family by being able to say that they wanted to leave the South for the urban North, but also they taught us the lesson of how hard the urban North is, that it wasn't the promised land, that the kind of segregation, discrimination they felt was something that shaped them. And I've always said growing up in Newark and Belleville taught me when to run, when to fight, and when to talk my way out of things. And in some ways, being a child of the migration, a child of integration, what you realize is that there were people in Belleville who treated me wonderfully.
Mm-hmm.
Other people who treated me horribly. I remember playing basketball in the backyard, and the mother came out to give everybody the drink of the day, Kool-Aid, and then she saw me and said, "Well, you drink out of the hose." So for me, I wanted to use history to first understand how I was being treated, understand the history of my local community, and then ultimately, history became my tool, my weapon to fight for social justice. So what I felt I was doing was simply standing on the shoulders of my grandparents and my parents, who fought for social justice in a way that they were famous only to the family. But like thousands of other people, they worked hard to change the world so to make sure their grandchildren and great grandchildren would have better opportunities.
So what was that? Did you, when you were living in Belleville, did you go back and, I mean, Newark and Belleville, for those, I mean, most people on this conversation probably know the proximity, how close they are, but some people may not. So did you go back and forth between Newark and Belleville? Or are you primarily in Belleville? And they were
I
very different communities, right? So,
Belleville was 99% sort of Italian and a small black community. So Newark was always a center for us, right? I can remember taking the 13 Broad down to Broad and Market, and my first job at Bamberger's on the loading dock. Newark was always a reservoir of blackness that we could dip into. It was always so crucial. And I have a million memories of my father taking me to buy hats off of Market and going to the movie theaters, but always finding black community to draw from. And so I think the one thing I regret is, for years when I was in high school, I could go up Springfield Avenue and see a window that had my grandfather's name. It said LG Bunch Dentist. And I wish I had been smart enough to actually get that. That building is long gone. But in many ways, Newark was really the sort of heart of our family.
Thank you for saying that. I'm curious about this idea of regret and preservation. So I'll come back to that. But I do want to ask you, I'm going to quote from your book, A Fool's Errand, which I love the title. A fool's errand, but apparently you were able to materialize unprecedented spaces for people to think about Blackness as a reservoir. So here's a quote from your book. But the wonder of the conversation was that everyone was engaged, and each person's contribution enriched the conversation and took the gathering in directions unanticipated. What I wanted was a museum that could replicate that excitement, ownership, and shared learning that came from these conversations. And so I guess I'm thinking of your family as one gathering space, Newark as another gathering space, and then you spent your life creating gathering spaces for everyone to be able to understand American history and African American history. And so, how did your relationship with your parents and your grandparents? How does that those gathering spaces affect your the types of spaces you wanted to create for everyone else?
I think in many ways it was shaped by those backyard barbecues, right? Of having somebody say something, and then Aunt Mary would take it in a different direction, Uncle Joe would take it somewhere else. And by the end of the conversation, there was such learning because people got to own where they went. And so I thought that's what I wanted in museums. I wanted them to be places that were ripe with history, driven by scholarship, but I wanted them to be places where people would not just learn, but engage. Would bring their own experiences. And so I've always argued that what museums do is they create informal communities, that suddenly they pop up and people cross racial lines and ethnic lines and revel and to talk around an artifact like, let's say, a slave cabin or Harriet Tubman shawl. And that, in essence, for me, my goal was to do several things. One, to say that African American history needs to be centralized, and that it is not the ancillary story, but it's the quintessential American story. And my career has been using museums as the space to do that. And then I think the second piece was to say that African American history is the clarion call to remember. And that in many ways, what I think we struggle with in this country is a sense of ahistorical. And that I really wanted to help people understand the centrality of history. And I think the creation of the African American Museum, its success, its position on the mall, has really contributed to new conversations about the importance of history and how history has shaped who we are. How, in essence, people are comfortable saying there's genetic DNA, but there's also historical DNA. And that's what I was trying to do.
So my first book was called Sites of Slavery, and when I was in grad school, and Skip was my advisor, I spent 10 years of my life in many ways trying to look at how African American artists and intellectuals remembered slavery in the post-civil rights period. So that's the period that we're in many ways still. And so I was thinking about this insistence on remembering the past that you're talking about. and the difficulty of remembering the founding sin or the founding trauma of slavery. And one of the things that's so amazing about the architecture of the museum, the African American museum, the history museum that you've created, was just that within the architecture, you're telling this long history of the Black freedom struggle, but that slavery is both central and the beginning, and not the full beginning, because obviously West Africa, but the beginning of the African American struggle. How did you balance trying to tell a story of trauma and also tell a story of not triumphant, but progress and struggle? Like, how do you do that both on an architectural level and then just in your collections, which are stunning, right?
Well, I think that first of all, I spent a lot of time interviewing people all around the world, talking about what did they know about African American history and what didn't they know. And the number one thing people didn't want me to talk about was also the number one thing they wanted me to talk about, slavery.
Okay.
And so I felt it was crucially important to really ground this story in slavery, but to do it in a way that was not about victimization. That I wanted people to understand that, first of all, slavery was both an African American story, an American story, and a global story. So it shaped us all, regardless of who you are. Then I wanted people to recognize that I would get all these letters saying, I'm kind of embarrassed about my enslaved ancestors. And that just so angered me. I thought, I wish we could be as strong as our enslaved ancestors. And so I wanted to craft something, not, a falsely heroic story, but to help people understand what it took to survive, to keep family together, to keep culture together. And then I thought, here we're building on the National Mall. And for those of you who know the National Mall, it's from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial. It's got a lot of Smithsonian and a lot of buildings that are white marble. And I said, I wanted to make a statement that says that there has always been a dark presence in America that was often overlooked or undervalued. So I wanted a building that actually spoke of that. But then I realized as we put together this building, and we really wanted to this be this sort of bronze corona, that we needed to figure out a way to sort of put holes in it, to be perfectly honest, because you couldn't have solid bronze. And the architect said, well, we'll just, use a computer and make holes. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. So I went down to Charleston in New Orleans and took images of all that ironwork by enslaved craft people, and that's what's over the entire building. So for me, the building is also a homage to remember that all these people who built this country, who will never know who they are, but that museum, when it glistens in the sun, suddenly that iron worker in Charleston or that person that worked in a factory in Alabama, they're remembered.
It's so interesting because in a way it's an inverse. So I have a chapter in that book on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. But when you go to
that is a great chapter. Your book is really good, by the way.
Thank you.
It's a great chapter.
Thank you. And I'm thinking about how with Monticello or even UVA, just using, or the Capitol, right, that enslaved labor is used to create these magnificent American buildings. But what you were thinking about was acknowledging the craftsmanship, but also paying homage to the labor. So it's a counterpoint in many ways to these other invisible practices that we have. So thank you for that. That's really it's a beautiful building as well. So I have another question about Black Power and the exhibition that Noel just kind of brilliantly laid out for us. So the exhibition is Black Power 19th Century, New York's first African-American rebellion. And the exhibition looks at Black activists and abolitionists, including Samuel Cornish. And so that prior to moving to Belleville and then Newark, Cornish was the editor of the first Black-owned newspaper in the United States, the Freedom's Journal, and later he would write one of the most damning accusations to New Jersey's political giant Theodore Frelinghuysen against the movement to relocate Blacks to Liberia. So my question, though, is one, I guess, I find it so fascinating that they're using a term that obviously is very 20th century, right? In some ways, Black Power, to think about the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. So one, I guess the question is, what does the term Black Power mean to you when you think of it, and us going back in time? And then the other question is, what can Black Lives Matter learn from these 19th century abolitionists?
I mean, I think you've really framed it brilliantly. For me, Black Power is really a two-sided coin. One side is the political undercurrent of trying to battle against slavery, battle against the American Colonization Society, trying to figure out how do you create organizations like the churches that provide, become the fountain that the community builds upon. But the other side of Black Power to me is that everyday life, is that person who in Newark integrates the public schools in 1872. It's the person who says in Newark, how do we create educational opportunities for Black children, even when the city says we shouldn't? And that for me, I have been really struck that one of the great strengths of the Black community is that Black Power is also saying, we are demanding that America live up to its promise, that America live up to its stated ideals. So in some ways, I am moved by Black Power as a way to protect, embrace, support Black folks. And through that effort, we're also forcing a country to deal with its own promises. And so I think that's the power to me. And what I love about Newark in the 19th century is you think about, you know, my home church, the Clinton Memorial. You think of these churches and how they became centers of abolitionist thought, how they really encourage people to use Newark as part of the Underground Railroad. So in some ways, Newark has always been a place of Black power and revolution. And I think the second part of your question is really interesting. And that is, one of the things I always talk to the people who are involved in organizing Black Lives Matter is to remember that you're building and standing on a huge foundation, that you do not try to simply emulate that, but you also have to recognize that one of the great strengths of Black power in the 19th and 20th century is that there were a variety of entry points, but they were all about strategically, how do you move the community? How do you find fairness? So what you want to see is that Black Lives Matter to use the tools and the weapons that they have today of social media and the like. But you also want them to recognize that the key to moving this country forward, the key to protecting Black lives is also to be very strategic, to think about what is it that we accomplish today, and then what are the longer term goals? And I think that's going to be the challenge.
So I read an interview that you did with the Washington Post this summer in June. So right at the moment in which you know, protests were happening all over the country, and just in terms of sheer numbers, it's the largest racial justice movement, and also one that for the first time in many ways had predominantly white people, at least in terms of the protest, right? So that all fits into the way in which African American freedom struggle has recalibrates how the nation sees itself. And so you say in this interview, you can't be a historian of Black America without being hopeful. And so I was just curious. It did sound like just now that when you say how we can talk to Black Lives Matter activists, that there is an optimism that one can have even in this moment, right? So you're saying that in June of 2020, when we're in a global pandemic, and also where you know, we're all protesting in some form this race or grappling with this racial reckoning. So to you, I was curious about. And I think I understand what you mean, but I would like you to explain a little bit more. What does that mean? What gives you hope, or what gives you a sense of optimism as a historian, actually?
Well, you know, remember I used the word hope, not optimism.
Oh, you
right?
did say
and
hope.
I, and
Yes.
I did make the distinction because for
You're
me,
right. Hope. You said without being hopeful. I'm sorry.
right?
Yes,
I mean,
no,
because hope is really recognizing here is a people who have transformed a nation. Here's a people who believed, who dreamed in freedom when no one believed freedom was possible, who believed in an America that people couldn't see. And so that gives me hope that there's a resiliency. But I also am clear that it is a huge and horrible struggle. And it is an ongoing struggle with great loss. You know, sometimes human loss, sometimes the kind of mental strain that's on the community. But looking at history, you have to say Black folks can survive and can change and can push a country. That's why I was hopeful. Um,
Hmm.
Optimism to me means you're definitely sure everything's going to work out. I'm
Hmm.
not that optimistic, but I am hopeful based on the past
Yeah.
that Black folks can push this country forward.
Yeah, and obviously many Black people around the country were hopeful in terms of the use of the vote in the electoral power. So right, so even within this entire year, that sense of hope that you're talking about was manifested throughout the country, despite all of evidence that we should not be hopeful. So yeah, thank you for that. I guess I want to go to the other side, which is regret, which you talked about in terms of. So when did you feel that? When did you realize that you should have done that? And how much does regret shape your preservation activism?
It's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way. You know, I can remember um, going, I guess I got my driver's license at 17. I think you still get that in New Jersey at
Yes,
17.
it's still at 17. Yeah.
So 17, okay. And you know, and I remember I was driving, the first thing I wanted to do was drive through Newark. I had my license. And I'm driving up Broadway and I stop basically at a traffic light near the old Essex Catholic High School. And there is a Black man, probably 30 years old, big
Mm,
afro, beard, you know, little scary, a little intimidating. And we're looking at each other. And when the light turns green, what he does is he nods at me and gives me a Black Power salute. And
mm.
I remember thinking as a 17-year-old, I'm part of the struggle.
Yeah, you're part of
And
the
you
part
know,
of the part of the movement. Yeah.
that's right. And as I turned up and went up Springfield Avenue, I saw this sign and I had forgotten it was there, the window at my grandfather's name. And then I went home, told my dad, said we should figure out something to do. A couple weeks later, we went back, it was gone. And
Mm,
so what I realized is that history is in our memory. We don't lose that. But what artifacts do is they stimulate that memory. They
mm,
provide the opportunity for other people to share their memories and to think about things in different ways. So not being able to collect that window always bothered me, probably
mm,
made me a pack rat, but it
mm,
also made me a curator to
mm,
say, how do we make sure that the opportunities to remember
mm,
through artifacts aren't lost? And
mm,
that's why when we built the museum, I went around the country to collect artifacts because I thought these are not just, these are the opportunity in a way for people to not just tell their story, but to be connected with other communities, other stories. And so for me, regret of not having that thing that said my grandfather's name has
mm.
really pushed me to making sure other people's stories are not lost when their artifacts are lost.
That's amazing. Thank you. I mean, I didn't know what you were going to say, so that was just, I didn't
Me
know
neither.
what, yeah, yeah. I didn't know that you were so young and that moment. It's clearly, so when you decided to go into like curatorial studies and become a historian, how did your family, I mean, for generate, like I grew up in a working class household and you
Mhm.
decide to get your PhD, it's a
Right.
really, I always say being a grad student is a life of leisure and poverty, right? At the
Yep, that's
same
right.
time. But so to choose the that path when you grow up without great wealth, it's all, it's an interesting decision to make. So what did your family think of your desire to, was it always, they could see it and they just knew that's who you were going to become or?
Well, I think that luckily, because of my grandfather and
Mm,
grandmother, sort of, he graduated college at Shaw in 1910.
mm-hmm.
So in
Yeah.
essence, I was the third generation of
Yeah.
my family to graduate college. So college was important.
Yes.
They of course thought I was going to be a lawyer. That's what,
Yeah.
you
Lawyer,
go to law
doctor.
school,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when I said I wanted to be a historian, my parents, who were teachers, couldn't see the difference between being a university professor and basically being they said, but we want you to be more than a teacher, right? So that
Mm,
was the real
mm-hmm.
struggle. But I always thought that I was just going to do the traditional academic route.
Mm,
And when I was finishing up graduate school, I was a TA, so I was broke, like every
yeah.
TA, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so there was a returning student. She was probably 40. And she
Mm,
said to me, you should go to the Smithsonian and talk to them about a job. And I remember thinking, who works at the Smithsonian? It's where you
yeah.
take
Yeah.
dates because it's free. And I went down there and they offered me a job. And next thing I know, my career is shaped by museums.
Hmm. Okay, so I see. So that it was unexpected in many ways. The whole,
Absolutely.
the whole.
I was just broke and needed a job.
Well, that's a possibility and opportunity for many people. So I think this is such a dynamic conversation, and I'm running out the questions. I remember I was wondering if we would run out of the questions. We have many left, so I will ask you just one more and try to connect the two. So, in terms of transgressing boundaries, when you're reimagining the potential of a museum to be engaging and interactive, and to be a place of like civic bonding, there's a number of ways that you've done it throughout your career. One, by embracing pop culture quite actively. So I was curious about that in terms of how you see the role of music or the role of artistic production in a historical context. And the other one is back to this issue of trauma and the Emmett Till installation at the museum, right? So these are two different, I mean, not completely different, but they're different ways of reimagining the museum as a transgressive space. Museums are oftentimes seen as quite conservative spaces.
Right.
And so
Right.
how do you see museums as places of subversion and transgression? I mean, how do you
Absolutely.
approach that?
I see museums, at least everything I've ever done, is said this is a weapon for social justice. So let's think about how we do that. So for me, because I used to teach film history, love popular culture, I always thought that that was a way that I could communicate with people in a way that would break down barriers, right? So having a major part of the museum look at music, but not look at it just as, tap your toe to Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington, but to help people understand what Sam Cooke tells us about urban America. What does Mahalia Jackson tell us about the challenge of gender? So for me, it was really saying popular culture is a way in that maybe is easier for many people. Let me use that to get to a deeper subject. And I think in some ways, for me, one of the most difficult and most important things we did was the Emmett Till story. When I was in Chicago, I got to know Emmett Till's mother. I didn't know she was still alive. And she came to have lunch with me when I was president of the Chicago Historical Society. And we were supposed to have an hour lunch. She stayed 7 hours and told me everything that happened from the time she kissed Emmett goodbye till the time she buried him. I was a puddle. I was tearful. I couldn't believe it. And I decided to write about her for I think it was the Chicago Tribune. But we became friends. I would go visit her. And she said something to me that she said her words were, she carried the burden of Emmett Till's memory for 50 years. Now it was my turn.
Wow.
And so when she died and I went back to build the museum, I was going to do something, but I didn't know what. And as you recall, Emmett Till's original casket was discovered when he was disinterred by the FBI, and it was supposed to be taken care of, and it really wasn't. So the family reached out to me and said, can you do something? And I thought, geez, I don't know, you collect the casket? So I initially said I will collect it and preserve it, but I never thought that I would initially exhibit it. But then as I was thinking about the museum, I said, the story is not just Emmett Till's broken body, but it's really the strength of his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, demanding that casket be opened so the world could see what they did to her son and how that reinvigorated the civil rights movement. So that's what we did. We decided to tell the story of the pain, of the heartache, but the story of how a woman at the worst moment of her life thought about the greater good. And that to me is so representative often of Black folks. That's why I wanted to do it.
Wow, thank you. So you and I also share Chicago in common. My organization, Allow Malcolm, is based in Chicago, and I was just curious about how did Chicago shape you? I mean, it's such a, as an activist, I mean, it's a powerful city. I mean, if anyone can spend time in Chicago, in terms of, it's similar to Newark in that way that you can grow as an intellectual, but also grow as an activist. And I was just curious how, listening to the story of Emmett Till just now in Chicago, that she was visiting you there and that he was from there, it shaped you in really important ways. I was just curious how did it shape your social justice identity?
My goodness, Chicago really is about, social justice. On the one hand, it's one of the most segregated cities you'll ever get to.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have the sort of legacy of Harold Washington. You've got this amazing, the Nation of Islam, Reverend Jackson. You've got this amazing group of Black women whether it's Margaret Burroughs, who creates the DeSable Museum, who use culture as a tool in the fight for social justice. So Chicago convinced me that you could make profound change, but that it was also a unbelievably difficult and long struggle. What I was moved by more than anything else in Chicago is how much Chicagoans loved their history, understood their history, and saw it not as nostalgia, but as a tool of transformation. And that I brought that back with me when I went to the Smithsonian.
So my last question for you is about your new role, and how it does really represent this central mission of yours, just to to see African American history as central to the American story and not part of not marginal to it, or not secondary to it, but central. And so I'm just curious about, you have many institutions that you're now in charge of, and so how does one, and I'll give you a really random example. When I used to go to Barnes and Noble, they would have African American literature, or they still have this, I think, and then they would have literature.
Literature.
Right? And then sometimes Black people would be in literature. They would have like double books, right? You'd have Zora Neale Hurston in both sections. Right. And I actually felt very comfortable. I thought that was an appropriate way of thinking about these traditions, specific and also as part of and constitutive of this other larger tradition. How do you think about that in terms of your new role, and way in which history has to be always integrated, but you still keep the specificity of at the same time? You're like the only person who has to, you really are wrestling with these things. I'm just
but I think your notion of Barnes and Noble is right. One of the things that Black people, especially Black scholars, we always have feet in two worlds. Yeah. Right. And so, in a way, now that I'm secretary of the Smithsonian, the first question is, why did I say yes? But that's another hour conversation. But what I realize is that, one, I could make sure that issues of gender, issues of Latino and ethnicity permeate the entire Smithsonian, whether or not we create separate museums or not. But what I also realized is that what I wanted was the Smithsonian to be a place that was as much about today and tomorrow as it was about yesterday. And so I wanted to give it a contemporary resonance, whether it was dealing with issues of race around George Floyd, or whether it is bringing the Smithsonian science to bear to help people understand the history of pandemics and the impact of vaccines, or bringing our scientists to help people understand climate change. So that in essence, what I want to do is find the right tension between the traditions of the Smithsonian, great exhibitions, wonderful collections, and innovation, new ways to reach audiences, new audiences, but to be a place that's of value. I want people to look back and say, the Smithsonian helped me understand X. It gave me the opportunity to grapple with Y. So I want the Smithsonian to have a real contemporary resonance to it.
Wow, thank you so much. Such a dynamic Saturday morning conversation. So thank you for joining us here in Newark, and I'm gonna pass it back to Dale. Thank you, Secretary.
Let me thank you, though. Really, your work is so important and continues to be. It motivates so many of us, so thank you. And it's always great to be able to have conversations with you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Happy Black History Month, everyone.
Thank you. We're approaching the close of this fantastic opening, and I want to give Dr. Tillet and Secretary Bunch a chance for some final comments. So Dr. Tillet, some closing remarks from you.
Oh, thank you so much. I wasn't, well, I just want to thank you all for creating this space. And as a child, my mother's from Newark and my grandmother migrated from North Carolina to Newark. So just the public library has always been central to my identity here. And thank you again, Lonnie. This was such a informative and educational experience for me to be in conversation with you. And I look forward to returning to the Smithsonian in months to come.
And I too want to thank you, and I want to thank the library, because for people like me, when I was starting out, there were places that weren't as welcoming, candidly, like the New Jersey Historical Society, but the library always was. And as a kid who loved history, the library became the place that I could first dip into and begin to understand myself and then the nation that I dealt with. So I want to thank the library. And I think that what you also remind us is that one of the most important things about celebrating Black history around Black History Month is that it is really an opportunity to help the public better understand who they are, understand who they once were, but maybe point them towards a better tomorrow. When you think about what Samuel Cornish did or Irene Munford, you think about all these people and you say, we're standing on their shoulders. We do not have the right not to continue to work hard, not to continue to challenge, not to demand a country be made better.
Thank you, thank you. I've been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I think 4 times, and I invite everyone who can to please visit. You'll need to go more than once, and also to visit all of the Smithsonian Institution, because the institution belongs to all of us. It belongs to all of us. Thank you, Secretary Bunch. Thank you, Dr. Tillet. On behalf of our Director, Jocelyn Bowling Dixon, and the Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, we thank you for joining us today, and much continued success to you all. Thank you especially to the PNC Foundation for their continued support of our Black History celebration. Thank you especially to my colleague, Diego Quintero, who's providing technical support behind the scenes. Thank you, Diego. This program and all of our programs will be archived and will be available on our social media feeds shortly. And Diego, could we show our flyer for our next program? Thank you. So please join us next Saturday for the music of Black Power, because we sure have a soundtrack for our Black Power movement. This program will feature a visual and sonic journey of African American musicians and culture. So thank you all for joining us. Be well and safe travels.